Hello and welcome to Stories Behind the Songs. I'm your host, Jim Tompkins. In each episode, I uncover the fascinating backstories behind iconic rock and pop tracks. Today's song is Without You by Harry Nilsson. Without You was a huge hit song when released in 1971, topping the charts in the US and many other countries. What many people don't know is the interesting history of the song and Harry Nilsson's reluctance with it, how its evolution spurred tension between he and producer Richard Perry, and finally, the tragic legacy of those most involved with its creation. To get to that story, we travel back in time to 1961 in Swansea, Wales, where a guitarist and singer named Pete Ham formed a band called the Panthers. Like most bands, the lineup of the band was constantly shifting, and in 1965 they became the Ivies. In 1968, the Ivies were playing in the Marquee Club in London when the Beatles' road manager Mal Evans saw them. At the time, the Beatles had just created Apple Records and were looking to recruit and develop new talent. The Ivies signed with Apple, but everyone hated the band name. Neil Aspinall, the fifth Beatle, suggested the name Badfinger Boogie, which had been the working title of the song, with a little help from my friends. Badfinger Boogie was shortened to Badfinger, and the band was newly christened. Their first hit song was a gift from Paul McCartney called Come and Get It.
If you want it, come and get it.
McCartney offered it to them on the condition that they keep the arrangement that he had already done and just supply the vocals. The result was a top 10 hit in early 1970 in both the UK and US, as well as a number of other countries. In 1971, Badfinger were working on their second album titled No Dice. Pete Ham and vocalist-guitarist Tom Evans both had written incomplete songs, both about the strain in their relationships with their respective wives and girlfriends. Pete Ham's song was called If It's Love and included the line, "Well, I can't forget tomorrow when I think of all my sorrow. I had you there, but then I let you go. And now it's only fair that I should let you know if it's love." The song had a problem, though. It lacked a chorus. Tom Evans, meanwhile, had written a piece of a song that was inspired when his wife Mary Ann had left him. He wrote a song called I Can't Live with a chorus of I can't live if living is without you. And so Pete Ham and Tom Evans simply mashed their incomplete songs together, and the result was a beautiful melody consisting of a very bittersweet verse followed by a heartbreaking chorus.
Well, I can't forget this evening and your face when you were leaving, but I guess that's just the way the story goes.
The song, now named Without You, was actually not thought of that highly by Ham and Evans, but it was good enough to be the last song included on the No Dice album. Without You wasn't released as a single and would have been a tiny asterisk in history if it weren't for the main character of our story, Harry Nilsson. Harry Nilsson, by 1971, was an accomplished singer and songwriter and also a legendary party machine. He'd released a number of albums, had a hit song, and penned a song that became a hit for another band. Harry Nilsson was at a party in Laurel Canyon when he heard Without You playing on the turntable. At first, he thought it was a Beatles song. For a couple of weeks, he poured through every Beatles album they'd released. Finally, he realizes it's not a Beatles song, and he decided that he wanted to record it himself. Now, we should take just a minute to talk a little bit more about Harry Nilsson, who's one of those fascinating characters in rock history. He initially found fame when the Beatles called Nilsson their favorite group at a press conference for Apple Records. He then scored a hit song when his version of Fred Neil's Everybody's Talkin' was used in the film Midnight Cowboy. The song became a top 10 hit in the US and won a Grammy. Then his song One was covered by Three Dog Night, which became a top 5 hit. Nilsson was an extremely talented artist. He could effortlessly play the piano and guitar. He had a golden, beautiful voice and was an established songwriter. But the thing about Harry Nilsson is that he was a legendary partier, drinker, smoker, drug user. He was close pals with both Ringo Starr and John Lennon of the Beatles, who also were big drinkers, smokers, and drug users. The other thing about Harry Nilsson, despite all the talent he also had a penchant for doing non-commercial records. When the industry was zigging, he tended to zag. The one big exception to that was the song Without You from the album Nilsson Schmilsson. For this album, he teamed up with Richard Perry, who had stunning success commercially as a producer in the early 1970s. Richard Perry agreed to work with Nilsson, but knowing Harry's wild ways, he insisted they agree that he, Richard Perry, would be the boss and have final say on decisions. But for Without You, Harry Nilsson wanted to do it his way, and he recorded a demo with him singing accompanied by just a piano.
Well, I can't forget this evening and your face when you were leaving, but I guess that's just...
Richard Perry, however, wanted to go a more commercial route, adding more production and even a string section. He recalled to Mojo magazine in April 2008 that he had to persuade an unwilling Nilsson to record it as a big ballad. I had to force him to take a shot with the rhythm section. Even while we were doing it, he'd be saying to the musicians, "This song's awful." When it came time to record the vocal to Without You, Nilsson and Perry had been butting heads and fighting about the production of the record. In the documentary Who is Harry Nilsson and Why is Everybody Talking About Him?, Perry said, "About halfway through the album we had a difference of opinion that didn't settle itself easily. So like two proper gentlemen, we decided to have a meeting over high tea at the Dorchester Hotel to discuss what we were going to do. I said, 'Harry, you do remember when you came to me and asked me to produce you, the only condition was that I would have creative control.' He looks me dead in the face and says, 'Well, I lied.' And with that, we realized we were late for the session to do his vocal on Without You. Without another word, we jumped into a taxi, ran down to the studio, and he went right up and sang the vocal you hear on the record."
You always smile, but in your eyes your sorrow shows. Yes, it shows.
The song version that Harry Nilsson didn't want to do, that he derided constantly in the studio, turned out to be the perfect vehicle to capture the beauty and range of his voice. Without You was released as a single in the autumn of 1971, and on February 13, 1972 reached number 1 where it stayed for 4 weeks. Billboard ranked it as the number 4 single of 1972. It also spent 5 weeks at number 1 on the UK singles chart, 5 weeks at number 1 in Australia, and 2 weeks at number 1 for both Ireland and New Zealand. One interesting moment happened after the final mix of Without You was complete. Harry Nilsson is working in Olympic Studios, where Badfinger also happens to be recording. Nilsson goes and finds them and says, "Hey, come with me," and takes them into the studio. There he plays for them that final mix of Without You. The guys from Badfinger have no idea he's even recording it. He plays it, and the whole thing hits them like a tidal wave. They are just dumbstruck and awed at the brilliance of it, and they absolutely love it, and perhaps realized that they had this beautiful thing all along but didn't know it at the time, and didn't know how to pull the full potential out of it. The great irony and tragedy of Without You, though, is that while the song has stood the test of time and made a lot of money for a lot of people, the 3 people most responsible for bringing this song to the world haven't. As for Badfinger, they had great success in the early 70s, but they were tied to Apple Records. Apple Records was created by the Beatles, but then the Beatles broke up, and Apple began to splinter. So Badfinger being tied to Apple turned out to not be a good thing. Secondly, from the beginning, due to their sound and being signed to Apple and the Beatles breakup, some looked to Badfinger as the heir apparent to the Beatles' crown, which was an expectation that no band could ever live up to. And finally, in 1975, a financial debacle sets in. The band's manager, Stan Polly, has been mismanaging the group and their finances. Panic was setting in for Pete Ham, who had a pregnant girlfriend and had just bought an expensive home. On the night of April 23, Ham received a phone call from the U.S. telling him that all his money had disappeared. That night, he and Tom Evans went to the White Hart pub in Surrey, where Pete downed 10 whiskeys. Evans drove him home at 3 in the morning, then Ham hanged himself in his garage studio. He was just 27 years old and wrote in his suicide note that the band's manager was a soulless bastard. Remarkably, 8 years later, Ham's Without You co-writer Tom Evans also hung himself, the day after arguing with his former bandmate Joey Molland about who should get what share of the Without You royalties. For Harry Nilsson, Without You and the Nilsson-Schmilsson album would be the apex of his career. After that, he continued on his drinking and partying ways, and when the industry zigged, he zagged. He would release an album of classic standards with a full orchestra, which does beautifully preserve his voice at its peak, But commercially, it was a flop, and beyond that, the albums he released throughout the 70s would be inconsistent efforts that had little commercial appeal, including a song from the Son of Schmilsson album with the infamous chorus, "You're breaking my heart, so F you." By the end of the decade, his career would be largely finished, save for some sporadic work on a couple of Hollywood movies. At that point, he channeled his energy into his family, his third wife Una, and their 6 children. But it turns out Harry, too, was a victim of financial mismanagement, learning in 1990 that his manager Cindy Sims had embezzled all the funds he'd earned as an artist. In early 1994, Nilsson died of heart failure at the age of 52. His wife Una said he literally died of a broken heart due to how he'd been cheated out of all his earnings. Pete Ham, Tom Evans, and Harry Nilsson are all gone, but the beauty and haunting passion of Without You lives on, perfectly capturing one of the era's most beautiful melodies and beautiful voices at its peak. The song has an amazing ability to tap into the universal human experience of heartbreak, loss, and grief. As long as people feel those emotions, the song will hold a special place in the hearts of listeners around the world. Here are some other interesting facts about Without You, Harry Nilsson, and Badfinger. Mariah Carey released a cover version which debuted at #1 in the UK in 1994 and hit #3 in the US. Nilsson died of heart failure on January 15, 1994, the same day Mariah's version was released in the US. One of the odd things about Harry Nilsson was that he never performed live. The closest thing you'll see to it is him performing for a BBC special in the early 1970s. He was filmed live, however, there was no audience present. It's a stunning performance that captures his vocal, musical, and songwriting capabilities that were so unique in that era. And although he never performed live during his peak years, he did perform Without You live once. He showed up unannounced to a Ringo Starr All-Star Band concert in the early 1990s, and Ringo convinced him to sing Without You. By this time, his voice was nothing near what it used to be, but Todd Rundgren, who was part of the All-Star Band at the time, said he made it work despite never having performed it live before. Several members of Badfinger were part of the sessions for George Harrison's legendary All Things Must Pass triple album from 1970, most notably playing guitar and percussion on the hit singles Isn't It a Pity?, My Sweet Lord, and What Is Life? Ham and Tom Evans also sang background vocals on Ringo Starr's single It Don't Come Easy, a song that reached #1 in both the US and Canada and went top 10 in 11 other countries. Without You won the Grammy for Best Male Pop Vocal in 1973. It was Nilsson's second Grammy. He won the Best Contemporary Vocal Performance Male Award in 1970 for Everybody's Talkin'. Without You was also nominated for Record of the Year and Nilsson Schmilsson for Album of the Year. Harry Nilsson had a flat in London throughout the 1970s, which he would sometimes loan out to friends, but the flat would turn out to have a morbid legacy. In 1974, Cass Elliot, formerly of the Mamas and Papas, was staying there, and after a strenuous performance in late July, she was found in one of the bedrooms, dead of heart failure at the age of 32. Then, on September 7, 1978, Who drummer Keith Moon returned to the same room in the apartment after a night out and also died of an overdose of prescribed anti-alcohol drugs. He was also 32 years old. One of the things that led to Harry Nilsson blowing out his voice was his album Pussycats. Produced by John Lennon in the mid-1970s, he and Nilsson would get into competitions to see who could scream and screech the loudest. Harry's 3.5-octave voice would never be the same after that. After John Lennon was shot dead in late 1980, Nilsson threw his energy into gun control lobbying, joining the Coalition to Stop Gun Violence. But as his wife Una stated in the Who is Harry Nilsson documentary, you had to admit that it really didn't change anything. Richard Perry would describe Without You this way. It was a different record for its time. It was a big ballad with a heavy backbeat, and although many artists have cut songs like it since, no one was doing it then. That wraps up the story of Without You by Harry Nilsson. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed it, please give it a like and subscribe to my channel, and I'll be back soon with another story behind a great rock and roll song.